Kia ora and welcome. My name is Mark Treadwell and this is the third in a series of video clips that are associated with the learning resource Learning How the Brain Learns. And so in this particular video clip, what I want to look at is the senses and our ability to learn via rote and or learn off by heart, and how that works, and also introduce the idea of understanding ideas and concepts. So, let's get into it. Our senses, and we have 23 of them, allow us to perceive the world outside of our skulls. In other words, our brain needs to actually get a sense of the world around us so it can compensate for balance, so it can actually allow us to keep various fluids in our body at certain levels. It allows us to sort of sense hot and cold. It allows us to see, to touch, to... All of the senses work together to make our world navigable. Okay, so that's the whole thing that it's all about. And when we combine our senses with our emotions, thoughts, ideas and imagination, it allows us to interpret the world around us. But we do that interpreting actually quite uniquely. People see the world quite individually. So each of us has a world view. So when we go into a house and someone might be showing off their new house, some of us think, this is fantastic, I'd love to live here. Other people think, my goodness, why would anybody live here? It's the same house. But somehow our interpretation of whether this has value for us is different. And that's the wonderful nature of human beings. They're all extraordinarily different and everyone has a world view, but it's also the source of our arguments. Because we can't agree on something because we have a world view that is different to the other person that we're arguing with. So it provides a framework, that worldview provides a framework for how we manage and make sense of our world. So let's have a look at how reliable our senses are. I'm going to put a picture up on the screen in a minute. There it is. Okay. Now the flowers in there, the purple ones are statice, and the nice colourful yellow-orange coloured flowers are paper daisies. And what I want you to do is I want you to stare at the picture for about 10 or 15 seconds and then we'll come back. Okay, that should be long enough. Now what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video for a moment and I want you to have a survey of the people in the room with you, or just yourself if you're watching this on your own, and I want you to try and, without going back and looking at the picture again, I want you to work out how many times, just by imagining the picture in your mind, how many times there's a paper daisy with statice on either side like this. It happens a number of times, or it might not, of course. There might be zero. But I want you to work out how many times that happens and then record that, and then I'd like the person who's running the session to actually work out how many people thought it happened never, once, twice, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 7 times. And let's see what the range of results is from that. So we'll just pause the video and I'll come back to you in a minute. Okay, right, so I can guarantee that if there's more than one of you in the room, that there was a difference in opinion as to how many times that status actually sat around both sides of the paper daisy. Some of you have said, no, it didn't happen at all. Others would have said, no, it happened 7 or 8, probably 10 times. In other words, 2 things come out of this. One is our worldview issue, that's quite different. But the other is, we can't actually see pictures in our head. Because if we could, we'd have been able to go back, have a look at the picture and go, ah, it happens X number of times. And we'd all get the same answer. But the truth is, we can't see pictures in our head. We don't have a photographic memory. We can't even see a fuzzy picture, and I know some of you are now saying, well, I can see something, but it's just a bit fuzzy. No, it's actually not possible. Biologically, physiologically, it's just not possible to see pictures in your head. We have a memory of certain things. If you strategically counted the number of plants or whatever it might be, trying to guess what I was thinking. You might have got the right answer, but it's unlikely you would have actually worked out the question that I was going to ask. So our senses collect raw material. It's filtered through our worldview, and we remember certain things depending on our previous experiences and also our predictions as to what the question was going to be. Okay, so you have a tainted data set. Okay, so our senses are not super reliable, as you can ask any policeman. You know, people around a scene of a crime afterwards, you get different interpretations of what happened. So our first learning system, our senses, we're pretty good at that universally, but we're not very reliable. In other words, they work well, but we're not very good at remembering what we sense and how we sense that. Okay, so imagining things in our minds is a great thing, but there's no pictures present. But what you have present is something much, much more rich, far richer than just a picture. Because when you remember someone, you remember what they were like, who they were, how they smelled, how lovely they were, how kind and considerate and sometimes grumpy and sometimes a bit officious as well. We remember the whole person, not just a picture. And the whole person is much better as a memory than just a picture. So if someone passes away, the first thing we do is go and get a picture, because we struggle to remember what they look like, even though we might have lived with them for 20, 30, 40 years. So our senses are okay. They work well in terms of sensing our world and telling our brain what's happening on the fly, but in terms of remembering things, long term, not very good. Right, next one. Our second learning system, rote learning. This is our worst learning system by a country mile. It is terrible, and it gets worse as you get older, but not for the reasons you suspect. But I'll come back to that later on. Rote learning is the ability to sequence things and remember things by repetitive learning. Sometimes we can just see one thing once and you just get it straight away. Other times it takes a lot longer. But the interesting thing about rote learning processes and sequences is that if you can get the start of the sequence, then generally you're away. So, for example, when you try to remember a song and the words to the song, if someone just hums a few bars, generally speaking, you'll pick up the rest of the music and quite possibly the rest of the words. If someone gives you a few bars of the music and a few words, then you'll almost always remember the song. So sequences are triggered. So we collect sequences of memories, not individual memories. If we start at the beginning of the song, then we can generally, that's what verse 2 actually does say. We can work that out as part of a sequence. So why is it so bad? Well, it's bad because, in fact, really, we didn't have to remember a lot of things by rote, off by heart, up until 200 years ago. 200 years ago, something quite significant happened. And what happened 200 years ago is that we invented reading and writing. And suddenly, well, we didn't invent reading and writing, of course, it's been invented for a long time, but it became popular and was mandated by governments as being necessary for everybody, and so they had to invent school to teach everybody to read and write. And so compulsory education came in over the last 200 years. And that changed our entire learning paradigm. Because up to being able to read and write, most of our learning happened through an oral and experiential processes. They weren't achieved through reading and writing, generally speaking. Learning to read and write displaced oracy and experiential learning with reading and writing. We didn't stop learning via oral language, we didn't stop learning through experiences, but the dominant platform would become reading and writing. And that has dominated our landscape for quite some time now. And if you couldn't read and write, you couldn't go to university. If you couldn't go to university, you couldn't get the top jobs, etc., etc. So reading and writing became very critical. But unfortunately, it all depended on how well you chose your parents as to how good you were at this reading and writing stuff. Right, so if you were good reading and writing, then generally you chose your parents well. And most of you listening to this probably chose your parents quite well. And so you got success at school in terms of learning to read and write. Because you can't look at the word rat and say to yourself, you know what, I've never seen that word before, but I'm guessing it's like a rodenty type of thing with whiskers and a tail and might be a bit scary. We don't know that. You actually have got to learn the word rat and associate it with the image of a rat. And so learning that is a very, very difficult process, because historically we didn't have to do much of that. We had a few people in our town or village, etc. We had to remember their name, because there's only one in those days before Napoleon came along and gave us 2 or 3 names. And we had a single name. We didn't have to remember lots of stuff. Stories were told and we repeated them, but we didn't repeat them perfectly. And so, you know, the Chinese whispers type routine happened, and so stories iterated over many, many years and changed and evolved and got more complex, and things added and things lost, etc., etc. But generally speaking, they weren't remembered very well by rote. So our rote learning is terrible. Hence, reading and writing takes 5,000 to 7,000 years, because all those letters, all those sounds, all those shapes have got to be remembered. All those words have got to be remembered. You need a vocabulary of about 1,000 words to really to get yourself going really well, to have competence in being able to interpret those as a reader and actually then produce those as a writer. So rote learning is very poor, generally speaking, and we have a distribution curve that describes where people are at. So generally speaking, as I mentioned earlier, the people watching this video, probably you're in the red group, which is always the top group, or the blue group, the middle group, or maybe a few of you might have been in the yellow group. But generally speaking, to do well in life, in terms of actually prestige and job and all that sort of thing, because that's a moot point, to do well in life, in inverted commas, you had to actually be able to read and write. However, that is starting to change. So we had that paradigm shift 200 years ago from an oral-centric world of learning to a text-centric world of learning. And now we're coming into a third paradigm, a new paradigm, the second paradigm shift. And the second paradigm shift has been brought about by those devices that we all have, our phones, our tablets, our laptops, and all those devices we have, which have all the knowledge we want in multiple formats, not just reading and writing. So generally speaking, educators go straight to Google to actually discover things. Most students, learners, go to YouTube, because YouTube takes away the necessity to have to be able to be literate, highly literate, to understand that work. Which is why we put these videos in the book. It allows everybody to learn universally at the same rate, because we're cutting out the rote learned bit. So here comes our major dilemma as we move out of this text paradigm, schools move out of this text paradigm into this video paradigm. When do we say to the child who's struggling to learn to read and write and doesn't do that particularly well, don't worry about reading the book, watch the video online, and then you can just make a video of yourself teaching what you now understand and know, and present that as your assessment piece, rather than having to write it out in a hall with 400 people in an examination setting, which is totally artificial. Because in life we don't actually sit exams, but we do have to remember things, and we do have to learn. And so in the world of lifelong learning, which we're now entering into, video will probably become the dominant format. And now we're going to have lots of debate about when do we say to kids, you can just watch the video, or you can just produce a video clip to represent your learning as an artefact. So producing artefacts now is going to become a really big part of the learning landscape. As we move away from producing, the only valid artefact was going to be what you wrote down. Now you can actually do it in many, many different types of media and combine media in different shapes and forms to suit the type of presentation you want to do. So rote learning is decreasing in importance as we move into this new paradigm. Understanding ideas and concepts increases in importance, because if you can understand ideas and concepts based on the knowledge you have that you learnt from your experiences, then you can actually be innovative and ingenious.